The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of the square which broke. The Gatlings jammed and the colonels dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. This poem by Victorian Sir Henry Newbolt recalls the battle in Sudan, where a ferocious attack by the Mahdi's army actually managed to get inside the British Army square. The ensuing hand-to-hand fighting became a soldier's battle, where training, adrenaline, personal courage turned a near disaster into a British victory. But at the loss of a larger-than-life Victorian hero, who some people believe was the model for George MacDonald Fraser's Harry Flashman. This is the story of the Battle of Abu Klea, fought on the 17th of January, 1885. I've produced several videos on the British involvement in Sudan, which sort of explained the background as to why the British were there, and I've put links to them actually in the description below. So I don't want to repeat it all again now, but just to put this battle into context, here is a very brief overview. In the 19th century, Britain's client state, Egypt, had built its own empire in Sudan. But by 1881, they were faced by a Sudanese revolt against their rule, led by the Mahdi. The Egyptians appealed to the British government for help, and the British allowed General Charles Gordon to assist the Egyptians evacuate the Sudanese capital, Khartoum. He was, however, under strict instructions from British Prime Minister William Gladstone that overseeing the withdrawal was the absolute extent of his brief. Arriving in Khartoum in February 1884, Gordon decided that having evacuated the Egyptian civilians, he would organise a defence of the city. Within a month, he was besieged by the Mahdi's forces. With Gordon besieged in Khartoum, British Prime Minister William Gladstone was in a dilemma. He would, quite frankly, have left Gordon to stew, seeing as he had deliberately ignored his job description. The British press and his political opponents disagreed and shouted very loudly that Gordon must be saved. And just for good measure, Queen Victoria joined this chorus. Reluctantly, Gladstone agreed to send an expeditionary force to Egypt to rescue Gordon. It was commanded by Britain's most able general of the day, or at least in his own opinion, General Sir Garnet Wolseley. I'm going to produce another episode about Wolseley's Nile expedition, the attempt to rescue Gordon, as a follow-up to this story. But once more, here is a summary so that we can get to the Battle of Abu Klea. Wolseley decided that the best way to reach Khartoum was following the Nile upriver from Egypt. Whilst it was a long route, it did have the advantage of plenty of water for his troops. The prudent Wolseley carefully and cautiously made his way up the Nile. But with time running out for Gordon in Khartoum, he decided to send part of his army from his base at Korti on a shortcut across the desert to arrive way up the Nile at Metemma and then to race towards Gordon. This desert column, consisting of 1,500 British soldiers, was commanded by Major General Sir Herbert Stewart. Sir Herbert Stewart was the son of a Hampshire clergyman. He was seen as one of the rising and most talented stars in the army, having attended Staff College, as well as being called to the bar, and having played first-class cricket for Hampshire. He'd been captured at the Battle of Majuba in South Africa, and then had served with Wolseley at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir in Egypt. In the previous year, he had commanded the cavalry during General Graham's campaign on the Red Sea coast of Sudan, where the British had unsuccessfully attempted to relieve the besieged Egyptian garrison at Tokar. He'd been at the battles of El Teb and Tamai, both of which I've produced stories about. And his effectiveness in those battles had earned him his knighthood. The main parts of Stewart's desert column consisted of the Camel Corps. This eclectic unit, comprising regular British troops riding camels, was formed into 4 regiments. The Guards Regiment, with men from the Coldstream, Scots and Grenadier Guards, along with the Royal Marines. The Mounted Infantry, as the name implies, drawn from infantry regiments. The Light Regiment, formed from the Hussars who'd exchanged their normal horses for camels. And last but by no means least, the Heavy Camel Regiment. Like the Light Regiment, it was made up of cavalrymen from the prestigious regiments such as the Household Cavalry, Dragoon Guards, Dragoons and Lancers. This Camel Corps, especially the Heavy Camel Regiment, was the unit for anyone who was anyone wanting to join the action in Sudan. One wag called it London Society on Camels, whilst Queen Victoria supposedly had to intervene to prevent the Prince of Wales joining them on active service. One Guards officer who did make the cut was Lieutenant Frank Baden-Powell, whose younger brother Robert would go on to defend Mafeking during the Boer War, and still later establish the Boy Scouts. The camel regiments were joined in the desert column by the 19th Hussars, who were mounted on Syrian ponies, and an infantry battalion, the 1st Royal Sussex Regiment. Rounding off Stuart's force were 3 batteries of Royal Artillery guns and the Royal Naval Brigade, armed with a Gardner machine gun. As Stuart's second in command, Wolseley chose Colonel Fred Burnaby, a larger-than-life, all-action Victorian hero. 42-year-old Burnaby had been commissioned in the prestigious Royal Horse Guards and had spent the last 20 years seeking the adventures of the 19th century. He was a skilled linguist who had ballooned across the Channel and travelled through war-torn Central Asia, having several scrapes with both Afghans and the Russians. Standing at 6'4" and weighing in at 20 stone, the larger-than-life Burnaby supposedly was the character that George MacDonald Fraser used as his model for Harry Flashman. Be that as it may, Burnaby had arrived in Egypt looking for adventure the previous year. He'd ended up volunteering his services to the Red Sea expedition under General Graham and had been wounded at the Battle of El Teb. The highly popular Burnaby then volunteered his services to rescue Gordon, and Wolseley had attached him to the desert column. Interestingly, whilst Sir Garnet had appointed him as second in command, Burnaby was a volunteer, admittedly with military experience, but acting in no official capacity. Third in command was Colonel Charles Wilson, the column's intelligence officer, but with the high-flying Stuart and the highly popular Burnaby ahead of him, there was little chance of him having to take command. Or was there? Listen to my next story about the Nile expedition and the race to rescue Gordon in Khartoum to find out. Before we go on, if you're enjoying this story, then please give me a like using the icon below. Due to a lack of camels, Stuart's shortcut took 2 weeks. And strange though it may seem, 1,500 British soldiers taking 2 weeks to cross the Sudanese desert had come to the attention of the Mahdi. As scouts from the 19th Hussars sighted the wells at Abu Klea on the 16th of January, they had a nasty surprise. Camped at the wells, blocking the British advance to the Nile, was a large Mahdist army numbering approximately 12,000 men. Incidentally, the officer who was second in command of the 19th Hussars on this expedition was a certain Major John French, who would go on to relieve Kimberley during the Boer War and to command the British Expeditionary Force at the outset of the First World War. It was now obvious to Stuart that his force of roughly 1,500 men would have to fight their way to the Nile through a force that outnumbered them by 8 to 1. That night his column camped in a thorn bush zareba, or compound, about 2 miles short of the wells. It was a night punctuated by the constant drumming from the Mahdist army and shots being fired into the zareba by their snipers. As dawn rose on the 17th of January, 1885, the men of the desert column rose to the sight of a gathering Mahdist army to their left. Stuart sent out the 19th Hussars and some skirmishers to try and entice them to attack his fortified position, but the Dervish army were too wise to fall for that tactic. With the Mahdists not obliging him with a battle, Sir Herbert Stuart decided to advance towards the wells. He ordered all the camel regiments to dismount and form a large square to move forward. Their camels were moved into the centre of the square, whilst the 19th Hussars on their ponies were ordered to move outside to the left to continue skirmishing and draw Mahdist troops away from the square. The front's left face and side of the square would be formed by the mounted infantry, whilst the front right face would be held by the guards. The right side would be held by the Royal Marine Light Infantry, whilst the Royal Sussex Infantry would be positioned at the back right corner. Finally, Stuart positioned the men of the Heavy Camel Regiment at the back left, along with the Naval Brigade and their precious Gardner Gun. Stuart and his staff officers would be in the centre of the square, a position made slightly more difficult than usual by the presence of the column's camels. This moving square had proved effective both at El Teb and Tamai the year before, with one slight hiccup, as well as at Ulundi during the Zulu War in 1879. Advancing in a square requires precision, so that the square retains its integrity and doesn't open itself up to attack. The difference between those 3 occasions and this moment was that those squares had been comprised of infantry, whereas Stuart's square had a large contingent of cavalrymen, now operating on foot, who didn't have the rigorous or tedious parade ground training of the infantry. Not only were many of the men forming the square inexperienced in this particular drill, especially the heavy brigade in the back left corner, but the square itself was hampered by the presence of over 2,000 irritable camels in their centre. And as they moved forward, they were further hampered by the uneven ground and the constant sniping from the Sudanese surrounding them. Armed with single-shot Remington rifles, the Sudanese sharpshooters had managed to use the natural cover of rocks, gullies, and the vegetation that was available to creep to within 400 yards of the square, and from that distance, their shots were having an impact. A constant cry of "Man down!" brought medical orderlies running forward to tend the British casualties and remove them to camels, which were acting as ambulances to carry the injured along with the moving square. Stuart ordered his square to open volley fire in the direction of the snipers, which had a desired effect in lessening this nuisance. The sniper nuisance had been diminished but not eliminated, and skirmishers were now sent out of the square to deal with them. Most of the skirmishers were drawn from the King's Royal Rifle Corps and the Rifle Brigade, now serving with the Mounted Infantry. As these men were sharpshooters in their own right, they started to use the terrain to play the Mahdists at their own game. At around 9:30, Stuart wheeled his column to the right towards some elevated ground. Almost at that same moment, thousands of Mahdists leapt out of a gully on the left and rushed towards the British square. In front of them, running for their lives, came the British skirmishers. An officer from the Mounted Infantry in the square bawled at them to lie flat so his men could present volley fire. The skirmishers took one look at the frenzied warriors behind them, armed with their razor-sharp swords, spears and daggers, and ignored his shouts. All bar one of the skirmishers made it back to the square, but that delay meant the Mahdists were now just 200 yards from the square. Finally, the British soldiers in the square, facing the oncoming rush, were able to fire a volley. It seemed to have no effect. The Mahdists just kept coming. In my previous stories about the battles of El Teb and Tamai, I introduced you to the Beja warriors of eastern Sudan. At Abu Klea, the majority of the Mahdist army were from the Bagara. The Bagara were traditionally nomadic cattle herders who inhabit the land stretching from Lake Chad across the Sahel to western Sudan, and they were some of the Mahdi's earliest and most loyal supporters. They came from a society with a strict honour code. A man wasn't a man unless he killed either a wild animal or an enemy in close combat. Whilst the snipers with their Remington rifles came from South Sudan, the Bagara eschewed the modern European weapons and preferred to fight with swords and spears, man to man. They didn't even bother with shields. And it was these Bagara warriors, wearing white robes and many with shaven heads, who were now charging the British square. Another volley, and still they came. It was only when the Mahdists were just 80 yards from the square that the British Martini Henry rifles seemed to finally have an impact. The Sudanese advance stalled. But it didn't break. In a move that some British officers thought was almost from the parade ground at Aldershot, the Mahdists, without any obvious marshalling, wheeled right, racing along the left-hand side of the square. Their target was the back left-hand corner. The advance of the British square had not been without its difficulties. Not only had the men of the Desert Column had to endure Sudanese snipers and the difficult terrain, but the cavalrymen were not used to infantry tactics and drill. And it was very hard for a square, even one composed of infantry, to keep its shape when you had over 2,000 camels in the centre. And as the camels were being used as ambulances, they had to keep stopping to pick up the wounded. Once they sat down to collect their patients, many simply refused to get back up again. The officers at the front of the square didn't adequately compensate for the lack of infantry experience, the terrain, and those camels. And slowly the square had started to lose its cohesion. Nowhere was this more so than the back left-hand corner, and the Mahdists had spotted this weakness. Led by their sheikhs mounted on horses and carrying their Islamic banners, the Sudanese warriors sped towards the rear corner. It was now that Captain Sir Charles Beresford, in charge of the Naval Brigade, decided to take decisive action. Sir Charles Beresford has appeared in my story about the bombardment of Alexandria during Urabi Pasha's revolt back in 1882. On that occasion, he had commanded HMS Condor and had taken us so close to the shore that Condor was under the Egyptian guns, whom he then proceeded to attack. Yet another one of those outstanding Anglo-Irish leaders who litter British military history. The 38-year-old hailed from Waterford. The Naval Brigade's Gardner Gun was his pride and joy, and with it he fully believed he could turn the battle against the Mahdists. Modern Victorian technology versus medieval-style Sudanese warriors. What could possibly go wrong? You're about to find out. But first, if you're enjoying this story, then please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss future videos here on YouTube. The Gardner Gun was an early machine gun, cranked by hand. Invented by William Gardner of Ohio, USA in 1875, within 5 years the Royal Navy had placed an order. Whilst Gardner's gun had performed well in the trials for the Admiralty back in London, it seemed to struggle with the desert's dust. General Graham had problems with both Gatling and Gardner guns jamming during his campaign on the Red Sea coast the year before, and it was about to happen again, with calamitous results. Colonel Fred Burnaby, Stuart's second-in-command, ordered the troops of the Heavy Camel Regiment to wheel out of the square to allow Beresford to run his machine gun out in front of the British lines to have a clear field of fire on the advancing Mahdists. Having exited the safety of the square, Beresford, the hero of Alexandria, personally chose to crank the handle of the machine gun. The Gardner spluttered into life, firing a rapid 70 rounds into the oncoming enemy, and then, click, the gun had jammed. The Baggara warriors, with their contempt for this newfangled weapons, swept down on Beresford and his gun crew. As his 7-man command was overrun, Beresford was knocked over by a dervish warrior and fell, dazed, under the gun carriage. When he came to and staggered to his feet, he was simply swept along with the mass of tightly packed Sudanese heading towards that back corner of the square. He later recounted that they were so tightly pressed together that he couldn't reach for his sword, and that the Sudanese warriors pressed against him couldn't manoeuvre their hands to attack him. It had all the energy, terror and hopelessness of a crowd stampede. Watching this throng charging towards the gap made as the Heavy Brigade had parted to let Beresford through, Colonel Wilson remembered thinking to himself, "By Jove, they'll be in the square." Burnaby, realising that his order to part for Beresford had now fatally weakened this corner, raced along the outside of the square, instructing the cavalrymen in how to reform their lines. The rear of the square dissolved as a torrent of Mahdists surged through the breach. A mounted sheikh actually rode into the square, planted his fag firmly in the ground and started reading from the Quran aloud. He was shot by an unknown British soldier and fell on top of his banner. The Battle of Abu Klea descended into a soldiers' battle. Officers were no longer able to issue smartly actioned orders. It was a hand-to-hand fight to the death. Amidst this chaos, as the square fell back in disarray, Fred Burnaby was surrounded by Mahdists. He took a spear in his throat and fell to the ground. Private Steele clubbed his way through the Mahdists and somehow kept them away from the stricken officer. The Mahdist throng pushed into the square, looking to attack the rear ranks of the other walls. Stuart's position was highly precarious. And then two things happened that were to save the British Army at Abu Klea. The first was those 2,000 camels. Yes, the same irritable camels who'd helped break the shape of the square, now without realising it, were to play a crucial role in saving the British Army. Because they acted as a solid barrier, preventing the Mahdists from running across the centre of the square. The second thing that happened was that the rear ranks of the square turned inwards to fire on the Sudanese warriors. The first off the mark were the mounted infantry under the command of Percy Marling VC. Do you remember him? He featured in my story about the Battle of Tamai the previous year when he had received Britain's highest award for valour, the Victoria Cross. They were joined by the men of the Guards and the Royal Marines, whilst over on the right-hand side of the square the men of the Royal Sussex found themselves slightly elevated, so they were able to fire over the camels into the Mahdists. The Mahdists, who just seconds before were sweeping into the square, now found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire. They were in a football-style stampede, and the only way out was plugged by hundreds of their fellow warriors trying to enter the square. The centre of the square became a killing zone, bullets flying in from all sides at the Mahdists. British officers were caught in the crossfire too, not least the senior officers in the centre of the square. Stuart's horse was shot from beneath him, and as he went down, 3 Mahdists made their way through the maze of camels to attack him. Colonel Wilson shot one of them, whilst men from the mounted infantry killed the others. The noise and sheer adrenaline can hardly be imagined. The shouting and swearing of the British soldiers, the notorious smoke of the Martini Henry rifles, the deafening noise of guns being fired in close quarters. A sergeant from the mounted infantry fired his rifle half an inch from Percy Marling's ear. The war cries of thousands of Mahdists, the screams of the wounded and dying, and the bellowing of panic-struck camels, many of whom were being mowed down by the British bullets. Some bullets hit boxes of ammunition on camels, which started to explode, and as the terrified camels tried to escape through the only gap in the square, they collided with the incoming Mahdists. It was chaos. As the British fire swept across the square, the ranks of Sudanese were thinned, and the corner of the square started to reform, trapping the last Mahdists inside. The Sudanese advantage had been lost, and outside of the square, their army withdrew in order and simply disappeared from the battlefield, almost as swiftly as they had arrived. The battle inside the square had lasted just 10 minutes, and after the mayhem and noise of those frantic 10 minutes came a sudden calm. Along with the dust and smoke, Major Lionel James Trafford wrote in his diary of an absolute, almost eerie, silence. And then, despite their lips being cracked and tongues bloated from dehydration, the British soldiers started to cheer. They cheered not so much their victory as their deliverance. Around 70 of their comrades had been killed and a similar number wounded, 10% of the desert column. Private Steele was found still protecting Fred Burnaby's body. Apart from the spear to his throat, the top of Burnaby's head had almost been cleft off by a Mahdist sword. Steele would receive the Distinguished Conduct Medal for staying with the fallen giant. Around him, officers and soldiers broke into tears. Such was the popularity of Colonel Fred Burnaby. Maybe I need to do a story about Fred Burnaby. What do you think? Tell me in the comments below. It had been a savage battle. Colonel Wilson recalled another officer being charged by a Mahdist warrior. Stepping aside from the Sudanese spear, the officer ran his sword straight through the warrior. Unable to withdraw his sword, the two men stood there looking at each other, rather like, as Wilson said, a fresco of two gladiators from ancient Rome. Gunner Albert Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross for defending both his gun and his injured officer, Lieutenant Guthrie, simply armed with the gun's handspike, which he used to fend off and then kill a Sudanese attacker. The British counted over 800 dead Mahdists inside the square, and a further 700 across the battlefield. Their losses had numerically been huge compared to the British, although their losses as a percentage of their force that day were similar to Stuart's, about 10%. But once more, the Sudanese had proved both fanatical and brave enemies. For only the second time in the colonial period, an enemy had got inside a British square. And had it not been for the barrier presented by the camels and the about turn of those rear ranks creating that crossfire, things may have been very different. Back in Britain, the battle was celebrated as a close-run thing, where the British forces were minutes away from disaster. A disaster that was only prevented by individual courage, tenacity, and British stoicism, as captured in Sir Henry Newbolt's poem. The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of the square which broke. The Gatling's jammed and the colonel's dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. But the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game. Victorian British imperial patriotism at its very best. But Newbolt had in fairness taken an artistic licence that Hollywood could have been proud of. The sand of the desert was not red with the blood of the broken British square, but principally of Sudanese warriors. The colonel was of course Burnaby, but he wasn't the colonel of one of the regiments, but was present as a volunteer. And the square had not so much been broken, but opened, possibly by Burnaby himself, to allow Beresford and his machine gun out. And of course, it wasn't a Gatling gun that jammed, but Beresford's Gardner. And whilst we're on the subject of Beresford, amazingly he survived the battle and was able to return home to his wife, Ellen Gardner. You really couldn't make it up. The British came away with an increased respect for an enemy who had come uncomfortably close to besting them with their courageous charge. But it was that very courageous charge that was the Mahdists' undoing. Had the Sudanese used their snipers to grind down the desert column, Stuart's square may have succumbed to thirst, allowing the Sudanese to charge a much weaker British army. And yet history is not about ifs. The fact was that the British had seen off a determined Mahdist attack, and were now able to continue their advance on the Nile, and from there they could rescue Gordon in Khartoum. And the fate of the Nile expedition and the attempt to rescue Charles Gordon from Khartoum will be the subject of my next story. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Watch out for my next one, all about the Nile expedition and the desperate rush to save Gordon in Khartoum. Until my next video, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.